The desert gas station was quiet. Almost unnervingly quiet. The kind of silence that makes you notice the wind, the shifting sand, and the distant hum of engines long before they appear. And then they came. 7 motorcycles tore across the horizon, engines roaring, tires kicking up dust, their presence announced before they even arrived. Each bike carried a man who looked confident, maybe too confident. They slowed as they neared the gas station, forming a loose semicircle around the lone figure standing by a black motorcycle. The man didn't flinch. He didn't glance around nervously. He just stood there, calm, collected, completely unshaken. It was Steven Seagal. Black leather jacket, matching gloves, dark sunglasses hiding his eyes but not his awareness. A man who looked like he had stepped straight out of a movie set. But those who thought he was just an actor were about to find out they were wrong. Very wrong. The leader of the group smirked, cracking his knuckles loudly enough for all to hear. "Looks like we found a movie hero," he said. Laughter followed, loud, confident, arrogant. 7 men, convinced numbers were everything. They circled slowly, sizing him up, each movement deliberate, each glance meant to intimidate. But Steven didn't react. No defensive stance. No aggressive gesture. Just stillness. And yet, in that stillness there was power, quiet, controlled, absolute. Years of martial arts had taught him something simple but powerful. Control your mind first and your surroundings follow. Every glance, every smirk from the bikers was recorded in his memory. Their confidence, their arrogance, their false bravado, it all told a story. The group thought they had the advantage. 7 men against 1. They believed in loud engines, posturing, and intimidation. But they didn't understand the truth about strength. Because strength isn't always visible. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's calm. Sometimes it's the way a man can stand alone, unshaken, and make the world hesitate before acting. The leader leaned closer, voice low but dripping with mockery. "You lost, old man?" Steven adjusted his gloves, slowly, deliberately, almost as if preparing for nothing. Yet in that simple movement the message was clear. He was ready. Not for violence. Not for show. But for the moment when the arrogance of others meets the discipline of a master. Steven had stopped at the desert gas station for a simple reason. Fuel. Nothing more. Nothing less. No entourage. No flashing cameras. Just him, a quiet man on a long, lonely road. The air was dry, filled with the faint smell of gasoline and dust. The kind of stillness that makes every small sound echo louder than it should. And that's when the bikers noticed him. 7 men, engines now idling, circling slowly, taking in every detail. He was alone. Vulnerable, some might think. The leader of the group nudged his bike forward slightly, leaning just enough to make Steven aware of him. "You look lost, old man," he said with a smirk, his voice carrying the weight of assumed dominance. A laugh followed from another biker. Then another. Confidence in numbers. Bravado. They assumed the situation was theirs to control. That just because they were 7 and he was 1 he would bend. That just because he stood alone he would show fear. But Steven didn't flinch. He didn't react. He just observed. His gloved hands moved slowly, deliberately adjusting as if brushing off a detail only he could feel. The movement was subtle but it spoke volumes. Focus, preparation, discipline. Years of martial arts had taught him patience. Not for show. Not for fame. But to see. To read people. To understand the energy of a moment before it became chaos. Every glance, every shift in posture, every smirk from the bikers was mentally recorded. They revealed themselves without knowing it. The leader, still leaning slightly, tried to provoke further. "I said, are you lost?" His tone carried more edge now, frustration creeping in. The others joined in, casual jabs, subtle pushes, little acts designed to unsettle. One biker brushed against Steven's bike as if testing his patience. Another deliberately stepped too close, invading his personal space. "Come on, say something," someone shouted, laughter mixing with the roar of engines. Still, Steven remained unshaken. No shout. No threat. No reaction beyond quiet awareness. And that was when a subtle shift began. The laughter started to fade. The confident stances wavered. The group, which had approached thinking themselves in control, began sensing something unfamiliar. Hesitation. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was recognition. Recognition that this man, standing alone, exuded something they couldn't challenge with numbers alone. Steven's eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, scanned them slowly. Each man's posture, each subtle tension in their muscles, each attempt at dominance, all observed. The desert's quiet seemed to press in, amplifying the moment. The leader tried once more, voice lower, this time sharper. You think you can stand there, alone, and not care what we do? Stephen's hands moved again, slow and deliberate. But it wasn't preparation for violence. It was preparation for control, showing that real power comes from calm, not chaos. That discipline, awareness, and presence outweigh arrogance, posturing, and loud engines. 7 men had approached a quiet gas station thinking they would intimidate. They had assumed weakness. And in that assumption they revealed themselves. And in that revelation, Stephen knew exactly how this moment would unfold. The silence of the desert gas station was almost palpable, broken only by the faint hum of engines idling and the soft scrape of boots against gravel. 7 bikers had circled Stephen, and for the first time, a subtle change hung in the air. Something was shifting. It started small. One biker, trying to assert himself, nudged Stephen's motorcycle with his boot. The sound was sharp against the stillness, meant to provoke, to test boundaries. Another biker bumped his shoulder lightly, a smirk curling across his face. Say something, one shouted, laughter filling the space, a sound meant to dominate. But Stephen didn't flinch. He didn't snap back. He didn't raise his voice. He simply breathed, slow and deliberate, and the quiet strength in his stance began to speak louder than any words. The leader leaned forward, eyes narrowing, frustration visible now. You think standing there makes you tough? He asked, voice low but sharp. His tone carried the assumption of power. 7 against 1, surely he would break. Surely he would react. Yet Stephen adjusted his gloves again, slowly, methodically. Every small movement was intentional. Every gesture carried control. The bikers, once confident and mocking, now felt a subtle unease. Their bravado, once loud and unshakable, started to waver. It was the kind of energy that isn't immediately visible but impossible to ignore. Discipline can have that effect. Awareness can have that effect. Presence, quiet, unwavering presence, can change the dynamic of a room, a street, a desert, even a circle of 7 men who thought they were untouchable. One biker laughed nervously, glancing at the others. Another shifted his weight, unconsciously creating space between himself and Stephen. They didn't even realize it, but their assumptions had already been dismantled. The leader's smirk faltered. He raised a hand slightly as if to assert dominance again. But something stopped him, a hesitation he hadn't felt before. The calmness of Stephen's presence forced a pause, subtle but undeniable. 7 men, so sure of themselves a moment ago, were suddenly uncertain. Stephen's voice broke the silence, soft but firm. Gentlemen, he said. Not aggressive. Not loud. Just steady, deliberate. The words didn't need to shout to be heard. The silence that followed carried more weight than any yell could. They had underestimated him. And in underestimation lies the first crack of power. One by one their postures shifted. Confidence turned into uncertainty. Arrogance turned into doubt. And in that moment the desert wasn't just quiet. It was tense. Alive. Watching. Sometimes strength doesn't come from the first punch. Sometimes strength is measured in how a man can stay composed when the world expects him to break. Sometimes power is in stillness. The leader took a step back without realizing it. Another biker glanced down at his bike, suddenly aware of how foolish their earlier posturing had been. The energy had shifted. The tables had turned, without a single fist thrown, without a single act of aggression. And all the bikers could do was sense it, feel it. A presence far greater than their numbers, far stronger than their mocking laughter. Backhand index pointing right. Has someone ever underestimated you, only for you to prove them wrong just by staying calm? The desert wind stirred. Dust lifted in small spirals. 7 men had thought they controlled the moment. One man had already shown them they did not. Stephen took a slow step forward. Not hurried. Not aggressive. Just deliberate. Each footfall on the gravel sounded heavier than it should have, not because of weight but because of presence. The bikers froze, subtly shifting their stance, suddenly aware of the change in the atmosphere. Enough, he said. The voice was calm, measured, steady, not demanding, not threatening. Just a statement. A fact. The kind that carries weight without raising volume. It was in that single word, in the way it resonated across the quiet gas station, that the bikers realized something profound. This was not a man to challenge with noise. Not with intimidation. Not even with numbers. The leader's smirk faltered. His knuckles unclenched almost unconsciously. The others stopped moving, hands resting on hips or hovering near bikes, unsure of what to do next. There was a subtle hesitation, the kind that only comes when someone quietly, completely, undeniably holds control. Stephen adjusted his sunglasses, briefly glancing at each biker. He didn't need to say more. Each glance carried awareness. He had observed every step, every breath, every flicker of arrogance. He already knew who would back down first. He already knew what each man was capable of. And more importantly, he already knew that none of them could shake him. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Dust swirled around their feet, wind lifting small grains, creating a hazy barrier that almost felt like a stage, a silent audience for what was unfolding. 7 men had approached thinking themselves predators, only to find that their target wasn't just a man. He was an observer, a master of patience, a strategist whose calm carried more weight than their combined bravado. The leader tried again, voice low and sharp. "You think you can just stand there and stop us?" Stephen shook his head, slow and deliberate. "I don't need to stop you," he said. "Come. Certain. You've already stopped yourselves." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't arrogance. It was a statement of reality. And reality in that desert was a teacher none of the bikers could ignore. One of the younger bikers shifted nervously. Another swallowed hard, suddenly conscious of how exposed they were. The subtle balance of power had completely shifted. They had assumed intimidation would carry them. They had assumed noise and numbers could dominate. And in that assumption, they had underestimated the quiet, the disciplined, the prepared. Stephen didn't move further. He didn't raise a hand. He simply allowed his presence to fill the space, a silent reminder that strength doesn't always announce itself with action. Sometimes, it's the quiet awareness, the disciplined patience, the steady confidence that does the work for you. The leader stepped back almost imperceptibly. Another biker nudged his friend, a subtle question in his eyes. "Do we continue?" The answer was clear without a word. Silence had spoken louder than laughter. Calm had outweighed chaos. And respect, quiet but undeniable, had entered the room. "Discipline," Stephen said softly, almost to himself. "Control. Awareness. Strength isn't in numbers, noise, or intimidation. It's in how you carry yourself when others expect you to break." 7 men who had arrived thinking they were in control, now understood that this man, alone, unarmed, silent, held power they could neither touch nor challenge. Fear? Not exactly. But a deep respect, an acknowledgement of their own misjudgment, settled over them. In that moment, the desert was quiet again. But the lesson remained: you don't always need to act aggressively to command respect. You don't always need fists, weapons, or threats to demonstrate authority. Sometimes, the mere presence of calm, deliberate, unwavering control is enough to shift everything. And in that stillness, one undeniable truth became clear. They had picked the wrong man. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think confidence and discipline can change a situation without a single act of violence? Stephen lifted his hand slightly, signaling he was done. The bikers, now quiet and reflective, instinctively stepped back. Their laughter was gone. Their bravado had been replaced by awareness. Sometimes the most powerful actions are invisible. Sometimes the most important lessons are taught without a word. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one everyone remembers. The desert wind whispered softly, stirring the fine dust at the bikers' boots. 7 men had arrived with swagger and confidence, believing they controlled the moment. Yet now, in the quiet that followed Stephen's calm display, every ounce of arrogance had faded, replaced with reflection and unease. The leader tried to reclaim authority. "You can't stop us all," he spat, voice carrying the frustration of someone who had expected instant submission. He wanted to assert dominance, to prove that his numbers and noise meant something. But Stephen didn't flinch. He didn't even raise an eyebrow. He simply observed, slow, deliberate, steady, a living demonstration of control. "You don't understand real strength," Stephen said, voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of experience rather than threat. "Numbers, noise, intimidation, none of that defines power. Discipline, awareness, patience, those do." The words lingered, echoing in the empty expanse of desert around them. Each biker felt the truth in them whether they wanted to or not. One of the younger men shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the ground. Another swallowed hard, suddenly aware of how little their posturing mattered in the face of quiet mastery. The leader stepped closer, fists clenched but useless against a presence that didn't need aggression to dominate. "You could have humiliated us," one whispered, almost to himself. Stephen's response was calm, almost gentle. "I didn't need to. Real strength isn't about domination. It's about teaching lessons without harm. About showing consequences without unnecessary force." The bikers looked at each other, the reality sinking in. 7 men who had relied on noise, numbers, and posturing now understood that those things were temporary. Discipline lasted. Awareness lasted. Calm lasted. Arrogance? That crumbled faster than they could imagine. It wasn't just about them, though. It was about the principle. About the universal truth that people often mistake aggression for authority, chaos for control. But the quiet, prepared, disciplined presence, that was the true measure of power. Stephen's gaze swept across the group. He wasn't angry. He wasn't threatening. He was simply present, a reminder that respect could be earned without a fight. Each man instinctively adjusted his posture, a subtle acknowledgement of the lesson he had just received. You assumed weakness, Stephen continued. You assumed control because it looked like it was yours. But the truth is you always chose to underestimate me. And that choice was yours alone. One biker finally spoke, voice low, unsure. We didn't expect. His words trailed off. No one ever does, Stephen said, finishing the thought. Confidence without discipline is fragile. Numbers without awareness are meaningless. And arrogance without humility is dangerous, especially to yourself. A silence fell over the desert gas station. The engines, once loud and threatening, now seemed distant and hollow. The bikers' energy had shifted completely. Where there had been aggression, now there was reflection. Where there had been mockery, now there was awareness. You could have reacted differently, Stephen said softly. You could have created chaos. You could have forced a confrontation. But none of that was necessary. Sometimes the lesson isn't in what you do, but in what you don't do. It was a truth they had not considered. Strength wasn't always measured by impact. Sometimes it was measured by restraint. Sometimes it was measured by awareness. Sometimes it was measured by the quiet confidence that leaves others questioning themselves. The leader lowered his gaze, realizing that the lesson had already been learned. And though pride and ego still stirred, he could not ignore the undeniable fact. They had misjudged the man standing before them. Not an actor. Not a random traveler. A martial artist whose discipline turned calm into power and presence into authority. 7 men had thought they controlled the desert. 1 man had quietly demonstrated who truly held power. And that power, invisible to the untrained eye, left a lesson far stronger than any punch or shout could have taught. The desert returned to quiet. The wind whispered, the engines idled, and the sun hung low on the horizon. Yet the lesson remained, clear and undeniable. Arrogance is temporary. Discipline lasts. Respect is earned, not demanded. And true strength doesn't need to prove itself. Backhand index pointing right. Should strength be used to protect, or to dominate? It was a question the bikers would carry with them long after the engines faded. They had arrived confident, expecting submission. They left reflective, humbled, aware that the man they had underestimated had not only shown power, but had taught the most enduring lesson of all. That calm, awareness, and discipline outweigh numbers, noise, and aggression every time. Sometimes the most profound victories aren't seen in action. They're felt. They're understood. They're remembered. And in that desert, one lesson would remain far longer than a fight ever could. The desert sun hung low, casting long golden shadows across the dusty gas station. The wind whispered softly, carrying fine grains of sand that danced between the motorcycles and boots of the bikers. 7 men had come expecting a confrontation. They had come confident, certain of control. They left unsettled, questioning the assumptions that had guided them. Steven Seagal stood by his motorcycle, calm and deliberate, his presence unchanged. His black leather jacket reflected the sun faintly, his dark gloves resting naturally on the handles. The wind tousled his hair just slightly beneath the sunglasses, but nothing could shake the air of absolute awareness he carried. Without a word, he lifted the motorcycle upright with ease. Not a struggle. Not a show. Just quiet control, a simple demonstration that discipline makes the impossible look effortless. The motion itself spoke volumes. One glance at it, and the bikers understood that raw strength and preparation are 2 very different things. No one needed to be hit. No one needed to be threatened. Yet the lesson was undeniable. The leader finally broke the silence, his voice low and tight. So, that's it. His words trembled slightly, betraying the doubt now creeping into his confidence. Stephen shook his head, slow, deliberate. No one needed to get hurt to understand a lesson. You chose disrespect. You assumed weakness. And now you've learned consequences. That's all that matters. The other bikers shifted uncomfortably. A nervous laugh escaped one, quickly swallowed by the tension in the air. For the first time, they realized how fragile their assumptions had been, how temporary their confidence was compared to the calm, disciplined presence standing before them. The leader stepped back, subtly, almost unconsciously. Another biker's hands lowered from his hips, and his stance softened. Every movement spoke of the internal shift they were experiencing, from arrogance to reflection, from aggression to awareness. Stephen didn't need to say more. Each action, each measured gesture, conveyed the lesson. He didn't escalate. He didn't threaten. He simply existed in that space, controlled, aware, and completely composed. And that composure, more than any force, had won the day. The wind carried the faint hum of engines, but the bikers no longer paid attention. Their focus had shifted inward. They were measuring their own reactions, questioning their assumptions, realizing how easily arrogance could blind them to reality. Stephen swung his leg over his motorcycle, the motion smooth, almost poetic. He started the engine, its hum steady, controlled, almost meditative. The vibration beneath him was subtle, but it signaled the finality of the encounter. The lesson had been taught, and the moment had ended. The bikers remained still, watching him. 7 men had thought they controlled the desert. One man had shown them who truly held power, not through force, not through chaos, but through discipline, presence, and awareness. And the lesson went deeper than them. It was universal. Strength isn't loud. Strength isn't about posturing or intimidation. Strength is control. Strength is patience. Strength is knowing when to act and when to let silence do the talking. You could have reacted differently, Stephen said quietly, almost as if speaking to the wind itself. You could have tried to force a fight. You could have created chaos. But none of that was necessary. Understanding the lesson is enough. A younger biker finally muttered, We never expected. His words trailed off unfinished because the truth was inescapable. They had underestimated the quiet, the calm, the prepared. And now they could not ignore it. Stephen nodded once, a subtle gesture signaling closure. Discipline beats arrogance. Awareness beats chaos. Calm beats noise. Remember that. The leader's jaw tightened, not in anger but in grudging respect. He glanced at his group. The others mirrored his acknowledgement, a silent admission that this encounter had changed something within them. Confidence without awareness was fleeting. Numbers without understanding were meaningless. Noise without control was irrelevant. Stephen kicked the motorcycle into gear. The engine roared softly, a reminder that he was leaving, but leaving behind a lesson that would linger far longer than any fight ever could. He began to ride slowly, the dust curling behind him like a trail of invisible wisdom. The bikers watched, reflective. Their laughter and arrogance were gone. In their place was awareness, the kind that comes not from fear, but from recognition of true strength. The desert was quiet again, but the shift in energy remained. Sometimes the most decisive moments aren't loud. They aren't flashy. They aren't violent. They're measured. They're deliberate. They're the kind of moments that leave people thinking long after the action has ended. 7 men had entered that desert confident. One man had left them reflective, humbled, and wiser. Not by force but by presence, by discipline, and by calm awareness. Backhand index pointing right. If you believe real strength comes from staying calm under pressure, comment below. The desert stretched endlessly, golden sand rippling under the fading light of the late afternoon sun. The gas station, which had moments ago been the stage for tension, confrontation, and unspoken challenges, was now quiet again. The wind carried soft whispers across the deserted expanse, scattering loose dust like faint echoes of the events that had just unfolded. Seagal mounted his motorcycle with effortless control. Every motion was deliberate, nothing rushed, nothing forced. The engine hummed steadily, a calm, controlled presence that matched the man atop it. Black leather jacket, gloves, dark sunglasses, the image of quiet authority, discipline, and awareness. He was ready to leave, yet the impact of his presence lingered like the fading desert light. 7 bikers stood in the sand watching. Their laughter, arrogance, and confidence had dissolved into reflection, unease, and understanding. The leader's jaw remained tight, a subtle sign of grudging respect. The others, some younger, some more seasoned, exchanged glances, acknowledging something profound. They had misjudged the man before them. They had assumed weakness where there was mastery, noise where there was control, and arrogance where there was patience. The moment was not about humiliation. It was not about defeat. It was about awareness, presence, discipline, control. In a world obsessed with proving strength through action, loud voices, and physical dominance, this encounter reminded them, and anyone watching, that true power is measured differently. Stephen's eyes scanned the group once more, hidden behind dark lenses, yet piercing in intent. He did not speak harshly, did not threaten. He simply exuded presence, a silent teaching of the lesson that arrogance collapses when confronted with preparation, patience, and calm awareness. "You came here expecting a challenge," Stephen said, voice steady and measured. "You thought numbers, noise, and aggression would guarantee control. But you underestimated discipline. You underestimated calm. And now, you've learned something far more important than who is stronger." The wind picked up, carrying loose sand across the asphalt, circling the bikers' boots. Their postures shifted subtly. Some folded arms across chests. Others shifted weight from foot to foot. The energy had changed completely. Confidence had turned to humility. Arrogance had transformed into respect. One of the younger bikers finally spoke, voice low and hesitant. I think I understand now. Strength isn't about making noise. Or about numbers." Stephen nodded once, a slight gesture, acknowledging the statement without comment. The lesson had already landed, deeper than any words could enforce. True power doesn't shout. True strength doesn't need validation. True respect is earned through presence, discipline, and awareness, not by dominating, not by humiliating, and not by reacting impulsively. The desert seemed to mirror the lesson. The sun dipped lower, bathing the sand in amber and shadow, creating an almost cinematic backdrop. Dust spiraled behind Stephen as he started his motorcycle, leaving the bikers in the quiet aftermath. Their eyes followed him, reflective, humbled. They had arrived confident, thinking they controlled the moment. One man had silently demonstrated the reality of true power. Sometimes the most meaningful victories are invisible. They are felt. They are understood. They are remembered long after the event itself. And this encounter was one such victory, a silent demonstration that discipline, calm, and preparation always outweigh loudness, arrogance, or posturing. Stephen glanced over his shoulder briefly, a subtle reminder that he was leaving, but also a final teaching. Respect and strength are choices, not demands. To exercise power is not always to act. Sometimes it is simply to exist with unwavering awareness. The bikers remained in the sand, watching as the motorcycle faded into the distance. Their minds processed what had just happened. They weren't angry. They weren't defeated in a conventional sense. They were reflective. Change. They understood that arrogance is temporary but discipline endures. That intimidation might control a moment, but awareness guides life. That fear is fleeting but respect lasts. And the lesson extended beyond them. For anyone watching, anyone who had underestimated quiet, disciplined people, the message was clear. Strength is not always about action. Sometimes it is about patience. Sometimes it is about presence. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the heaviest weight. In that desert, no one was harmed. No one humiliated. Yet respect had been earned, more profoundly than any act of aggression could achieve. Stephen had walked away, leaving only the proof that control, patience, and awareness define the truest form of power. As the motorcycle disappeared along the horizon, the desert returned to silence. But the lesson lingered, invisible yet undeniable. True power is calm. True strength is control. Arrogance collapses when faced with preparation. Discipline always outlasts bravado. And perhaps the most important question remained for every observer. Could you have walked away like Stephen? Could you have demonstrated strength without violence, patience without anger, and presence without provocation? The bikers would remember the encounter for the rest of their lives. But the greater lesson extended to anyone willing to notice. The quiet, composed, disciplined individual is often the most powerful force in the room. Sometimes, the most profound victories are won without a single blow. Backhand index pointing right. Do you think the bikers learned their lesson? Backhand index pointing right. Could you have remained calm under pressure like Stephen? Speech balloon. Comment below your thoughts. Thumbs up like if you respect calm confidence over aggression. Repeat button. Share with someone who underestimates the quiet, disciplined people around them. The desert stood still. The lesson remained. One man had shown that true power is not in force. It is in patience, awareness, and quiet control. And that lesson, unlike arrogance, would last forever.